Today we're exploring how anxiety hijacks learning through the lens of... Whoa. Oh my god. Today we're exploring how anxiety hijacks learning through the lens of something scientists are now calling the body budget. It's a 2025 concept that's changing how educators and psychologists understand memory, motivation, and focus. So stick around until the very end, as I'm going to be sharing with you 3 tricks that you can do to help get their memory back online in less than 90 seconds. Hello and welcome. My name is Sarah Lynn, and this is the Mindful Toolbox podcast, where we connect neuroscience, compassion, and everyday parenting. So let's dig in a little bit. Why can a simple question, one that we've revised and we definitely know, why can it feel so difficult to answer in a variety of different scenarios or environments? Now, in episode 3, we explored the flip the lid way of teaching the brain. We have our memory-saving elephant, which is our hippocampus, being at the center of an open palm. We have the wise owl, which sits on our fingers once we close that hand to create a fist. That's the prefrontal cortex, and they're there to make all of the wise decisions. And of course, we cannot forget about our guard dog, which is the thumb that tucks into the closed palm. The guard dog represents the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is there to sense danger. And what happens is when that danger is sensed, the guard dog, it barks, and it barks so loud that it makes us flip our lid. Our prefrontal cortex, it stops being able to work at the same capacity. And that wise owl, it flies away. Now, this is still one of my favorite ways to teach and explain the importance of knowing what an amygdala is and understanding how we can calm it, regulate it, and just get to know what its triggers are before it goes into that barking fest. But we are going to add on to it a little bit. See, more recent research by Lisa Feldman Barrett from the University of Harvard shows that the brain constructs what we call feelings. But they don't just do it on the whim, they do it by predicting what our body sensations mean in a given context. She calls this predictive regulation. This is huge for us because the brain is actually forecasting the energy it will need before the moment even happens. And it does this by looking at all of our past contexts and experiences to find out if this is going to be an exciting kind of butterflies or an anxiety, I want to crawl under my covers kind of butterflies. So in essence, our brain is kind of acting like an architect. It's combining all of the different inputs from our bodily sensations along with previous millions of memories to decide which label we're going to have here, which feeling we're going to experience. Is it anxiety? Is it excitement? Is it nerves? Is it joy? And a big part of this is based on how we're feeling and where our body budget lies. That's why the same math test can feel totally different depending on whether or not your child has slept, if they've eaten, if they had an argument on the way to school. It's the body budget deciding, we are already in an overdraft here. We need to conserve some energy, which means we pull it away from things like memory. So what does this mean? Well, I feel like we're really getting into it, so we're gonna grab a drink here. Okay, when I was 9, I had a very, very strict teacher who didn't like it if we forgot our books in our locker. And as someone who's now been a classroom teacher, I understand where she's coming from. I get it, it's disruptive. But as a fairly disorganized child, this was my daily mistake. It's almost like the fact that I knew I would get in trouble caused me to forget the book. And that makes sense if we look at our flip the lid method. My prefrontal cortex knew that it wasn't going to be able to work because my guard dog already sensed. It had the predictive knowledge that I would need to feel anxious. Because I knew there was no getting around it. I was going to be told off in front of my peers. And so I would just grab the wrong book again and again and again. And I lived in anticipation of being told off constantly. So much so that it created this habitual thinking within my body, and it wasn't even tied to thoughts. There was no thought that, oh, I'm going to forget my book again, get it wrong, be told off, oh, I must have a stomach ache. It was just ingrained within my body that I was going to have a perpetual stomach ache every single day after break. And we couldn't figure it out, like why this was happening. But these experiences, they built over time. And when I moved to a new teacher, my brain, it still held on to that story. It predicted that I would be in trouble for forgetting. And so I was immediately anxious every time I walked into that class. Gratefully, this new teacher, though, she was so different in her approach. Instead of reprimanding me, she helped me come up with, a system. And I know that's probably where you're like, this makes sense as to why Sarah Lynn is so big on systems. And it probably has something to do with that I've had incredible people before me help to see where I struggle and helps me organize things. So one of the systems that we did was we organized all of the books in my locker in order of what I'm going to need. And if that wasn't enough, we then color-coded my timetable so the subject matched the color of the notebook. Sounds so easy, right? This teacher went one step further, and when she was standing at the door greeting all of our students, which she would do to everybody, she did one extra step with me. She told me the color of the book that I would need before I even got in. So it was never a question of whether or not I would get the right book. And then it actually became a game where I would get to the doorway and I'd be so excited to show her I had green and it was science and I needed green. That teacher didn't just calm my fear. What she did was she helped me rewire my predictive brain, my brain that assumed the feeling that I would need before I even entered the scenario. But I'm not gonna lie, I was still really anxious going into class for an extremely long time because of that hardwired story that my brain had that I would need to feel those feelings of anxiety and worry. And even now, I have uneasiness that I might be forgetting something when I leave the house, but thankfully I have, you guessed it, systems and routines to help me manage that anxiety a little bit better. So what happened here? Well, firstly, my prefrontal cortex, that wise owl who would typically know which color notebook to bring to class, its activity, it decreased. And secondly, my brain predicted that this situation of walking into the classroom, it would feel threatening. And it generated some physiological pattern that it had learned before. So even when I didn't have to feel anxious, even when I was with a new teacher who had created a very different learning space for me, I still had the initial feelings because it had been a predictive pattern that was ingrained within me. Those predictions, they needed to be updated, but that can only happen through repeated, safe experiences. But Sarah Lynn, how does feeling anxious walking into a classroom because you know you're going to get told off because you brought the wrong color books has anything to do with my child's brain literally forgetting everything that they've revised? It's the same thing. Their brain has a predictive story that tells them that when they go into the exam, it's going to be unsafe, uncomfortable, and anxiety inducing. So, how can we take control of anxiety so it doesn't hijack our brain? First, let's look more deeply at the body bank metaphor that I introduced in our last episode. This is by Feldman Barrett's team, and they're using it to explain how memory is impacted when we're stressed. So it goes far beyond any academic realm. This is any brain in any stressful situation. So the way that we dive into this metaphor is to think of your child's body like a bank account. Every reassuring moment that they have puts money in the bank. But every stressor is going to take a withdrawal. So when that balance runs real low, which typically happens in an exam scenario, the brain is automatically going to divert funds like oxygen, like glucose, like attention from things like memory in order to stay safe. If the forecast says this is an unsafe territory, the brain spends its body budget on survival, which means there's way less for learning and for remembering. If I can share a little bit more imagery here for you as well, it's very similar to our body's setup, our natural automatic system, that when we get cold, it's our extremities that get cold first. And that's because blood moves away from your extremities, your fingers and your toes, and moves into your core because that's where all of your organs are. This is like a ingrained system to help keep us protected and safe. So this new 2025 model by Barrett and her and the team, it talks about how we can reframe regulation to energy accounting. So when anxiety burns through that budget, the brain then has less energy to distribute. So it's going to cut the funding to those optional departments like remembering what we revised last night, and puts it towards our normal day-to-day states. And science frames this as stress-dependent memory because stress literally blocks access. It doesn't tell us the ability that we have. It tells us our body budget is running really low. So the real question then becomes, how long can we get the brain back online? Because we don't want to eliminate stress, and that's not even realistic, but we do want to know how we can reactivate it. So Dr. Bruce Perry's 2025 data, it shows that unfortunately it's not an instant scenario. It's not just a switch that we can redivert the energy back to memory. Instead, it suggests that we need around 90 seconds of rhythmic regulation before we can even connect. And then we need another 90 seconds before we can start reasoning. And again, the neuroscientist Bruce Perry, he calls this the regulate, relate, reason ladder. And it's not just a nice slogan that we're dealing with. This is new 2025 data that shows that the brain literally takes about a minute and a half to move up each of those rungs from regulating, relating, and then being able to reason. This is why we've talked about breath and rhythm before we can even start reasoning with a child that we're trying to speak to, or an adult that we're trying to speak to. So we need to give the brain its 90 seconds, and then memory will come back online. It's important that we keep this in mind not only when we're the adult, the parent, reasoning with our child and not understanding why they won't get something done because it logically makes sense for them to do it. But it's also important for our children to know this as well, because the talk that happens in an exam typically ends up being, I know this, why don't I know this? Why can't I remember? Come on, remember. That's a reasoning aspect. We can't do that yet. We have to first regulate the anxiety that we have so we can replenish the body bank energy and then have the energy to go back into our memory and retrieve that information. This is why building safety around the unknown, and that includes exams and tests, that's why it's so important. It can reduce the negative impact on our body's brain bank, which ultimately means that if your child feels safe and has positive experiences around exams, they're gonna have the energy then to remember what they've learned. That's it. That's like one of the biggest keys that will unlock so much for them. But how do we do that? Well, a lot of the students that we work with do visualization. It's the children who practice walking into the exam hall, like literally seeing the desk, pulling out the chair, knowing what pens they're going to have laid out beside them, hearing the shuffling of the paper. Those children who have practiced that kind of visualization, they outperform the students who walk in blind. It's because their brains already budgeted for what is exactly gonna happen. I mean, to a degree, of course, there's gonna be things that we can't account for, but they're gonna have the budget for it. So let's open up our toolbox and add three more tools that we can use to get the memory back online so it stops hijacking our exams. Interestingly enough, tool number 1 actually comes before we even write our name on the paper. This is called predict and preview like a professional. Because the new science that tells us that we have predictive regulation, our brain decides what kind of feeling we're going to have before the event even happens, it suggests that if we spend 2 minutes scripting out what's going to happen the next day with our child and the scenario that they can expect to take place, all things considered, it reduces the amount of error signals and miscoding that the brain actually creates for ourselves. Therefore, it reinforces a feeling of calm and safety for your child. Because if your child even plays sport, for instance, I'm sure we've talked or they've heard about their favorite sport or their favorite athlete, their favorite musician doing visualization before the game and going through all of the plays. We visualize not just what's going to happen, but how are they going to stay calm when the entire auditorium is screaming their name and cheering them on. So tomorrow, you can try this. Sit down and talk for 2 minutes with your child about what kind of difficult might be coming up. For our EBS&A children, it might be that they're looking at going into school for that 1-hour session. Or for our students getting ready for exams, it might be getting ready for a mock or for their actual exam. Remember, this part here, it's often overlooked because we think we need to rehearse the answers. But this is rehearsing the calm. Looking at tool number 2, this is micro predictability cues. So in episode 10 and 13, linked here, we talked about structures and systems and how it can help our neurodivergent children. We're going to lean into these systems and these structures for all of our children. A 2025 Spanish neuroscience, Herrerias, found that predictable routines can cut the working memory load by nearly 1/3. That's 33% of the working memory load taken away from a child just because we have predictable routines. So what are we going to do? We're going to pick out our favorite pen that we're going to use in our exam. We're going to choose the song that we're going to play every single day before we revise, so it becomes a beat that signals to the brain, we've done this before, we know what we're doing. These things, they sound like they're just trivial or they're superstitious. And you know what? Maybe they are. The science supports it, but hey, if you want to say it's superstitious, why wouldn't you lean into it and give your child that 30% extra memory protection? It enables our brain to find a rhythm that predicts calm over anxiety. So those little cues, the same song, the favorite pen, cutie little mugs, they aren't superstitious. They're signals of safety. But we can dive into this a little bit more. It's not just the environment that can cue signals of safety. In fact, in episode 6, we talked about a key revision technique that promotes memory. Anyone remember it? One technique that everyone refers back to when we talk about how do we prepare in the right way. It's going through past papers. And there's a reason why it's such a successful technique. It literally allows us to get acquainted with the structure, the layout, the timings, the wording of the exam. This means we're learning the systems and routines, which helps us to predict calm. So if your child's getting ready for an upcoming exam, help familiarize them with the format of the exam. And you know what? This is not just papers that we can see as big exams like our GCSEs. Go onto your school's website and look for past exams. They're there. They'll help your child to at least understand the content that they're going to be asked. It's there in the learning plans. Guys, predictability shrinks anxiety's power. So yes, the same pen, the same song, the same sip of water before they move on to the next part. They all whisper to the brain, we've done this before, and we're okay. We can keep going. And that leads us to our third tool. And this one happens during revision and again in the actual exam. This one is movement, because movement repairs thinking. Maybe you've not heard someone say this to you, but the amount of times I've heard someone say this to me is unbelievable. They've said, you have a lot of beans today. And I feel like I heard this since I was little. I would be that person who's constantly playing with my cup. If you're watching us on YouTube, I haven't stopped fiddling with it. I'm the one who plays with the rings, fidgets with my hair. When I have a pen in my hand, the ink is all over my hand. For the longest time, I held this belief that having a lot of beans meant that I was different, but not in a good way. That because I couldn't sit still probably meant that I wasn't concentrating, because that's the input that I was hearing. Therefore, I couldn't be a very good student, could I? And when I started teaching, I carried the belief there too, that sitting still meant success. This did not last very long. I realized that my most engaged students were the ones standing at the windowsill doing their homework, tapping their pens, bouncing a ball under their desk, and sitting on the floor kicking their legs. Movement didn't distract them. It connected them. And I still remember the amount of times I'd walk into the teacher's lounge and teachers would say, like, oh, your class is quite boisterous. And I would just smile. 10 years ago, this was such an uncommon approach to learn. Luckily, though, Dr. Bruce Perry from the Child Trauma Academy shows us that rhythm isn't just calming, it's actually reparative. That patterned, rhythmic, repetitive movement that you see your child doing when they're swinging on their chair, bouncing, clicking their pen, all of those things, especially bilateral movements, it literally helps the two halves of our brain to talk to each other again after stress. So Perry, he calls it our regulate, relate, reason sequence, right? We've talked about that. And the new data tells us that it's time sensitive. It's not just conceptual. We need 90 to 120 seconds between each of those stages for optimum memory power to go back on. So movement actually fits into that ladder, into that sequence. Rhythm literally knits together both parts of our thinking brain. 90 seconds of patterned movement can reopen the memory faster than any amount of reasoning or reassurance. So how do we use this in revision and test scenarios? I mean, we can't have our children walking around the auditorium when everybody else is writing their exams. Unfortunately, we're not there yet, but what we can do, and what we do with the children that we work with, is we encourage them to find a little tick, something that they can do when they're in that test scenario, like drum out the familiar tune before they start the new section of a new exam. This is why having a pre-homework starting song is ideal. You know, some of my absolute favorites are like, Are You Gonna Be My Girl by Jet, or Seven Nation Army by the White Stripes, or All the Small Things, Truth Care by Blink-182. And yeah, these may have identified me as a 90s baby. So your child may not have the same taste of tune preference, but go through it with them. Figure out what kind of music they want to learn as their cue to their brain that they're going to start doing their homework. When your child fidgets and bounces or hums, they're not misbehaving, they're rebuilding their brain. Movement is not distraction, it's repair. All the small things. So let's bring it all together. Today, you've learned 3 ways to help your child keep their memory online, even if anxiety is trying to take over. Tool number 1, it's called Predict and Preview Like a Professional. Let's help their brain forecast calm before the challenge even begins. Go through visualization with them, even if it's just talking about where they want to sit. Do they want to sit by the window? Do they want to sit at the front of the room, at the back of the room? Go through helping them to create a safe environment in their mind before they even enter that classroom. Tool number 2, micro predictability cues. Small, repeatable rituals that are going to tell their nervous system, hey, we've been here before. We were safe then, we're gonna be safe now. Find that favorite pen, find that color that they wanna wear on their exam, even if it's just a headband tapped around their wrist. It's a color that signals safety. And finally, tool number 3, movement repairs thinking. Rhythm reconnects the 2 halves of the brain. So maybe don't overly encourage them to be bouncing all over the place, but when they are, know that it's their brain reconnecting after they felt a little bit stressed. None of this is about perfection. It's about small, rhythmic moments to remind the brain we can do hard things calmly. So the next time your child is getting ready for something a little uncomfortable, whether it's walking into a new classroom or getting ready for an exam, try one of these. Predict together what they can expect. Repeat small rituals that you start grounding today, and give them confidence that their movement is actually helping to calm their brain. If this episode has helped you to see anxiety and memory a little bit differently, share it with another parent who's been walking a similar road. We want to make sure that everybody knows that reducing working memory load by 30% is done very quickly and very easily at home with absolutely no cost. And make sure you subscribe down below so you don't miss our next episode. Next episode, we are unpacking how persistent absence connects to partial timetables and what parents can actually request when school feels too big for your child. Until then, keep breathing, keep experimenting, And remember, safety before strategy, always. Take care.